Hi, welcome to Chapter 1. This is Miss Nikki. I'm going to give you a quick review of Chapter 1 and kind of focus on the items that students seem to have the most troubles with during the chapter. So let's go right to it and talk about scientific method. So here, make sure the pen's on the color that I want. Let's do green. So they're saying the flow diagram for scientific method. First, you have an observation. You see something. 2, you come up with a hypothesis or a reason. Then you develop an experiment, and hopefully you come up with a conclusion. And then if we do this process multiple times and we keep coming up with the same answer, then we usually come up with a scientific theory, and we're going to talk about some scientific theories in the next couple of slides. But one of the things I like to point out about this process is that we do this all the time. We just don't think or realize that we're doing scientific method. So I'll give you a really easy example. Let's say your car won't start. Will not start. Go out to your car won't start. That's the observation. You see that your car won't start. So what do? You come up with a reason. Remember, a hypothesis is a reason, something that you can test. You'll say, maybe it's my battery. So then you carry out an experiment. You take the battery out of the car, you bring it into Walmart or wherever, you change the battery out, you bring the new battery back, you put the new battery in the car, and your conclusion after the experiment, between the experiment and the conclusion, does the car start or doesn't it start? So let's just say car starts. Your conclusion is your hypothesis was correct, the battery was the problem. Let's say that the car doesn't start. So we get to the experiment, we change out the battery, we still can't start the car. Then you have to do what? Conclusion is, this was incorrect. Let's go back to the drawing board and come up with another hypothesis. Alternator, right? So we do this on a daily basis to problem solve. We just don't know that it's called scientific method. Okay, when you design an experiment, you want to make sure that you have control groups. And I think that this is a good example of a little more difficult or complicated scientific method and then some of the controls that we can use. So in this particular example, they're saying the hypothesis is if you take winter wheat and pigeon pea, these are plants, and you rotate the crops, you plant this one or this one first and this one second, that the wheat production will increase better than artificial fertilizer. So you're saying if you do a crop rotation, the second crop will yield more than if you just use fertilizer. So let's look at this good design that they've come up with. Here's a control pot. So this one is just winter wheat. That's all that's being grown in this pot. This test pot 1, it's winter wheat, plus we added the fertilizer. This is test pot 2. This one we grew pigeon pea first. We used the same soil, and then we grew winter wheat. So they're saying that there must be something that's being left behind in the soil by the pigeon pea plant in order to make the winter wheat plant grow. So this would be a good design or setup of an experiment, and you have to have a control pot because how do you know what a normal yield is? How do you know what's a lot of winter wheat? How do you know what's not a lot? So this is a good design. So let's talk about some of these theories that we've come up with. And again, what is a theory? If you do an experiment after experiment after experiment and we get the same results over and over hundreds of times, thousands of times, then we start calling it a theory. Is it possible for theories to change? Yes. But so far, everything, all of the information and all of the facts and all of the experiments that we've conducted have pointed us in this direction. So cells are the fundamental unit of living things. There has to be a cell in order for something to be called living. And we organize biological organisms into these levels. So these are called levels. There's atoms, molecules, cells, tissue, organ system, and organism. This is the smallest, and this is the largest. Here's another figure in the book, kind of shows you, and this I kind of see more of the umbrella. So this is larger, this is smaller. But what they're also trying to tell you is that the top level cannot happen or cannot exist if you do not have the bottom levels. So we start off with an atom. Molecules, you have to have atoms. To have a cell, you have to have molecules and you have to have an atom. To have tissue, you have to have a cell, you have to have molecules, and you have to have atoms. So basically, you can draw a line. Anything below is necessary for this level to exist. You do need to know these levels of organization. You need to know that an atom is the smallest and that an organism is the largest, and be able to put them in order. So if there was a test question about which one of these answers has the levels of complexity of biological organisms in order from greatest to least, you could do that. Greatest to least. The other, or I should say next theory, we're going to talk about more than just one or two, is the gene theory. So this is DNA, and DNA consists of these letters. We'll talk a little bit more about it in Chapter 3 when we talk about nucleic acid. But there are 4 letters, and they're in various combinations, and that is called DNA. These letters are going to code for proteins to be made. And proteins allow us to carry out specific functions within the body. So there are structural proteins that help us maintain our shape. There are proteins that help us carry oxygen, like hemoglobin. There are proteins like collagen that allow us to have flexibility and allow our skin to be pliable. There are proteins abound in the body, and all of this instruction to make these comes from DNA. So what they're trying to show you in this picture is that bacteria, this is a paramecium, a plant, a mushroom, an animal, all of these originate from DNA. They all have DNA. We've yet to find a living organism that does not have DNA at its core, or maybe I shouldn't say core, but the center of its being. The next example here is the theory of homeostasis. It's a little bit easier to explain if we were talking about anatomy and physiology. When I teach anatomy, we have to spend a lot of time on homeostasis, but this picture is trying to show you plants. We've been talking about plants, so I figured I'd show you this picture. Homeostasis is if you're responding to some sort of stimulus. So you can see that this plant is growing towards the sunlight, and plants need sunlight in order to make food and grow. So you can see that this plant is trying to bend towards the light in order to receive more light in the leaves and have photosynthesis and create more glucose or sugar. So we also have homeostasis. You can think of our body temperature. If our body temperature gets too hot, we start sweating and it cools us off. If we're too cold, we'll start shivering, and that supposedly causes your muscles to contract, and that elevates your body temperature. The next theory that we're going to talk about here is the theory of ecosystems. They basically want you to understand the energy flow and the chemical flow. So when we're talking about energy, we're either talking about sun, we're talking about heat, we could be talking about ATP, which we haven't talked about yet, but this is energy for the body. And then chemical, they're talking about maybe the ions or electrolytes that are given off. They could also be talking about glucose. So chemical structures. So sunlight shines down on the producers, and let's think of these as plants. And the plants make glucose. That's sugar for them, so they can grow. And then we eat the glucose and turn the glucose into ATP. If you're a predator, you can also eat prey, right? These are both consumers. So the rabbit is a consumer, but so is the hawk. Now the hawk is going to eat the bunny and turn the proteins in the muscle, and it's going to break that down and make ATP, or energy for the body. And then if the animal dies and decomposes, we have decomposers like bacteria and fungi, which are going to break down the organic material from the animal, and they're going to turn it into energy for them, and also heat is released at all of these steps. We'll talk a little bit more about thermodynamics when we get to chapter 2 or 3. Okay, we're on to the theory of evolution. Basic evolution is showing relationships in which organisms emerged from. So they're saying this was a common ancestor, some of the first cells, and through some sort of environmental event, we branched off into two separate organisms. So bacteria here, and I say archaea, but some people say archae. And then there was another branching off of this archaea, and now we come up with protists, plants, fungi, and animals. And we're probably familiar with these two. This, they're showing you mushrooms. Protists, these are usually in water. They're the little creatures. Some of them are more complex than others, but mostly think of water, aquatic environments, and that's where you'd find protistas. So what they're trying to say with this chart is bacteria and archaea are older, right? They come from this first common ancestor. Archaea, do you see how this branching occurs off of archaea? What they're saying is everybody below it, let me erase this. So see how this branches off of the line that goes to archaea. So everybody over here is more closely related to archaea. But yet archaea and bacteria are more closely related. So you could think of archaea as the in-between. Another thing that we need to focus on here at the bottom is where in the legend where it says domain, kingdom, and common ancestor. I really want to focus on these two, domain and kingdom. So we have 3 domains, and then within eukarya we have 4 kingdoms. So this is a domain, this is a domain, this is a domain. And then within eukarya we have 4 kingdoms. These have their own kingdoms. We just don't worry about them as much when we're talking about biology. You would go into a specialty if you really wanted to learn and talk about all the kingdoms within bacteria and archaea. Another point that I should draw a line here is that these, we call them prokaryotes, and these are called eukaryotes. Do you see how close the domain name is to eukaryotes? What they're trying to say is this is before, and this is before they had a nucleus. We don't know what a nucleus is yet, but basically if you have a cell, inside that cell you're going to have a nucleus, and inside that nucleus you're going to have DNA. Remember, DNA is the code for all the proteins that that cell is going to make. So if the DNA is inside the nucleus, protected, it's a eukaryote. If you have a cell and the DNA is just free floating, that is a prokaryote, before a nucleus. That's all that it means. So you can also look at these and think about what does it mean if it's a prokaryote versus a eukaryote. So prokaryote, eukaryote, these are less complex, more complex. So some of these levels of classification, domain, kingdom, phylum, order, or phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So the domain we just looked at, eukarya, this is the largest or most broad, and then this is the most specific. So smallest, specific, largest, broad. One of the ways that you can remember the order of these is by looking at the first letter, and there's something called mnemonics. You can Google the word mnemonics. You make up a phrase. So mine is dancing karaoke players can order free grape soda. You do need to know this order. I will not make you know these individual steps. You just have to know this part right here. But you can see we're both in, this is a human versus corn, we're both in eukarya, but then at kingdom we switch to animalia and plantae. And then usually the species, this is the name, this is the one we usually use when we talk about a specific species, we will say Homo sapiens. So we also need to understand the characteristics of life. So characteristics of life, life is organized, we use materials and energy, we reproduce, we are homeostatic, we respond to stimulus or stimuli, we form ecosystems, and we evolve. So life is organized, we have cells, we use materials. Well, we just showed the picture of consumers and we said we take glucose and we turn it into ATP energy. We reproduce. Most of us know that females develop eggs, right? And males develop sperm. And later on in the semester, we'll see the process that has to happen in order for eggs and sperm to be developed. And then these come together during fertilization. Homeostasis, I talked a little earlier about some of the homeostatic events that happen within the body. But basically, we can regulate internally. Respond to stimuli. If you stick your hand in hot water, you're going to pull it out, right? You don't just leave your hand boiling in a pot of water. So we respond. We form ecosystems. We saw that in the earlier slide when we talked about plants producing glucose, and we talked about animals that then consume the glucose and turn it into ATP. And then life evolves. We looked at, excuse me, some of the theories of evolution, and so we know that we all stem from a common ancestor. Okay, well, that's the end of my Chapter 1 presentation. I will see you guys for Chapter 2.